Today, we're welcoming to the podcast Dan Fish. Dan Fish is the Director of Strategy over at Go1. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much indeed for having me. Great to be here.
So we're excited to have you on. This season of the show, what we've been doing is, kind of trying to walk our listeners through what it means to bring on new learning technology, what it means to sort of plan out your learning strategy. And so a big part of that conversation, of course, is content, which is an area that I think Go1 has quite a bit of expertise in. Is that right?
You would be correct in saying so. Yes, I mean, we've really made the world of content our business after sort of starting off our life more so in the learning technology space. So it's definitely been a journey for us. We sort of started off our life as a learning management system, but very early into that journey realised that, whilst technology is probably, one of 3 or 4 key drivers in this space, content is definitely right up there. So, and what we saw back at the beginning was that there was a number of players out there bringing large swathes of content together, but no one really looking at it, I believe, in the same way that we were, as far as sort of this real big aggregation push. So we've definitely made it our lives over the last 4.5 years or so to really position ourselves as such, as an aggregator. And for us, it's not just about land grabs or big swathes of content sat within a marketplace, also very much around the smarts and data and insight that comes with that. So yeah, content is kind of our thing.
So on that, in your opinion, what exactly makes an effective piece of learning content? And on top of that, what does Go1 look for when they're adding new content to your already extensive library?
Yeah, I think it's a really good and actually probably a slightly bigger question than some would anticipate. I mean, the difference, especially, there's the 2 components, I guess, with this. Obviously, one is online and one is face-to-face. And whilst we are a digital sort of SaaS platform, we definitely 100% promote a blended approach to learning, so face-to-face and digital. We don't want to totally take away the humanistic elements of learning and the energy that you get when you're in a group of people. But I think the other thing when we're looking at the digital side of things is that learning, more so than probably a lot of other pieces of content out there, is incredibly subjective. So you've got, Netflix doing TV and movies, you've got Spotify doing music, Amazon doing books, Kindle. And that's fairly straightforward, right? Because all you've really got from a sort of subjectivity perspective is the genres and to a degree. So different types of music, different types of books. Whereas with learning, it's slightly more complicated in that there's a number of different types of content you can experience, whether it's audio, video, interactive, slides, and so on. So you need to be really careful, and I'm always very careful when I talk about what is an effective piece of learning, because it is incredibly subjective. I think more so the better question is geared around content. So understanding that certain bits of content, so a quick 5-minute short video could be good if you're sort of really listening on the fly and, in the middle of on your way to a meeting or whatever it might be. Whereas if you're really trying to immerse yourself in something, some of that sort of deeper, interactive, challenging content can be really good. But I think there's a really important component that I think gets missed a lot, and especially from a digital perspective when we talk about effective learning and effective pieces of content, which is that context. And I sort of always bold that, put it in capitals and lots of exclamation marks after it, because in a way, what makes content effective is that sort of right content at the right time and delivered in flow. And there's a lot of different flows and there's a lot of different timings where content can be delivered. But I think that's a really important part of what makes an effective piece of content.
So you obviously have a lot of expertise, but what pieces of content have been the most successful at Go1? Because obviously I know you guys have got such a big catalogue there, but there must be some formats that stand out perhaps?
Yeah, so I think, again, going back to the subjective nature of training, there's a lot of different types of content that tend to be successful. And again, sort of, I'm going to talk a lot today about context just because it's super important. And I think we can sometimes get caught up in the idea of having to invest tens of thousands of dollars in really beautiful looking content. But if it's not surfaced and injected at the right point in time and in context, then it can really fall back. But what we've seen to be successful, if we sort of go back over time and look over the last sort of 4.5 years, is certainly some of that key stuff that we've looked at from when we started the business, which was around compliance and continual professional development, which is where that piece is legislated for certain roles and jobs, whether it's nurses or lawyers, where they have to do a certain number of hours of training each year. And that was certainly very popular at the beginning. I think there's a big difference between, again, sort of the other aggregated mediums, and whether it's TV or music, etc., where a lot of that stuff is a nice to have versus the sort of must haves with education and training that can be the case a lot of times. So we'd see a lot of the stuff around sort of bullying and OH&S. But as that's moved on now, I think we start to see, and with more skills coming to market and thinking more specifically about the future of work piece, we've started to see a lot of popularity around topics like design thinking. And a lot of those are areas, depending on what side of the fence you sit on at the moment, around sort of automation and AI and machine learning, etc., will depend on whether you see it as a positive or negative. But I think that's definitely driven a lot of people's desire to understand the world a bit better as from a future perspective. So we've also definitely seen some of those sort of attributable future of work skills, training, pieces of content really come to the floor. Yes, I think again, it's the data that we look at. There's a very much a high, if you think about it in a graph format, there's a lot of content out there and quite popular around sort of leadership, communication. And if you think about it on an axis, it's sort of lots of that. And then it sort of tails out to sort of nuanced and a very long tail of different types of content, whether it's sort of future skills or whatever it is, but definitely seeing a lot more of that.
So, I'm curious, what do you think for organizations, and especially as organizations right now are thinking about elevating their learning programs or even just sort of putting them in place because of everything going remote? What do you think organizations should be thinking about from your perspective that maybe causes a piece of content to fall flat? Is there something that kind of sticks out where it's like, you really should be making sure you're watching out for this or for that?
Yeah. Yeah. I think, look, there can be a number of things that can really help weigh content down, and it can be really simple things, right? So you could have some really effective and compelling content, but it could be as simple as the accent being wrong, right? So making sure that for thinking about specifics of and things like geographies can be really important. So if I'm in the UK or in Sydney or in Toronto, trying to deliver some training to my team, and the accent is in Australian or English or Canadian, that can instantly create a little bit of friction. And that's not to say that people are inherently sort of racist around accents. It's just more so that, there's some familiarity when they hear something in their own one. So I think there's thinking about little details like that can be really important, right? And so, again, I think the other piece is sort of setting and framing of the content. So making sure that, whether it's OH&S or, whatever it is, it's if I'm a field worker and I spend a lot of time out in the field, I'm looking at content that is office-based, sort of more white collar, then that instantly also sort of sets up this lack of association. So I sort of just disengage. I think the same is also true when we look at representation of people. So whether that's down to sex, age, or disability, it's amazing some of the content around access and disability that I've seen that almost ignores some of the key components of that. And the same with sort of age and sex. So I think that it's really important to be mindful and aware of that. But I think the underlying piece to it and something that's quite important to us as a business and me and my own thinking is just, again, this idea that there isn't this one size fits all approach to content. And I think it's why for us, this concept of an aggregated marketplace works really well, right? So if you think about Spotify, they have, what I want to listen to when I go to the gym on a Wednesday lunchtime is different to what I listen to before I go out on a Friday night, is different to what I listen to on a Sunday morning. So having that breadth and selection of content to be able to sort of curate your way through that is really important. So I think, making sure that there's that representation is critical, whether it's accent, sex or context, but also then being able to pull on that right content to plug into some of that stuff is critical, because that's, some of the feedback and criticism that we've heard in the past, whether it's organizations creating their own content or content that we look to surface is, oh, well, that's great if you're in Australia, but I'm in London and I need something with a UK accent. And we've been able to sort of build that out ourselves over time to be able to ensure that we've got this very global view of the world, and understanding that someone who's in Toronto or someone that's in London or someone that's in Sydney will naturally gravitate and associate more to content that is familiar to them.
For sure. And on a similar note to that, you kind of touched on it a little bit. But how do you think that organizations should balance, making their own pieces of content and the content materials with outsourcing content? I know you're a bit biased to this. What would be the kind of balance for you, would you say?
Look, I don't know whether... I mean, the one thing I would say is making your own content is both time consuming and super expensive if you want to do it right. So, and there's if you take into account all the informal content that's out there, like podcasts like this or blog posts or articles, like there's literally billions of pieces of content out there. So I am biased in my thinking in so much that there's a critical difference here. There's two words, there's creation and there's curation, right? And so I tend to lean on the side of curation a whole lot more than creation, because the chances are the content already exists and there's people out there focused on creating that are going to do a better job than you. Now, that being said, there is a critically important piece when it comes to organizations creating their own content, which I totally agree with, right? Which is around, custom onboarding pathways for new staff. You don't really want other people building that out you could engage an instructional designer to build it out with you, but that very much needs to have the soul and culture of the organization front and center and the brand. So it's really important to be able to do that. I think there's also other components, right? And our two organizations would experience this as well when we're thinking about content that we create for our customers. And there's a big piece at the moment going on where more and more now, whether it's something that you'd naturally think about training up your customers or not, or whether it's your business to train up your customers, there's obviously a very important component when you're building content there. So I think it is a balance. I think I'd always urge people to think about and look at what already exists, because I think this concept is becoming more and more comfortable with people in sort of L&D and HR now, that I don't need to create it, I can source it. But that's not to say that I don't think there is space and time where it absolutely needs to be done by the organization. And the one thing I would say with that is, if you have people within your organization that are instructional designers, fantastic. Like that, then right. Utilize them, leverage them to help you create your content. But if not, it is worth investing a bit of money and bringing those types of instructional designers in for the very reasons we've said before, and that there's content that it's very easy for this content to fall flat. Like what you might think as an L&D manager when you're in there creating a course is really compelling, it may not be for others. So I think, you want to engage the organization to make sure that if you are going to create this content, what is going to be compelling, but also maybe look at engaging instructional designers to help you build that together. But what I do know about Docebo as a platform is that it is quite easy to create that content. And so again, you don't want to my point earlier, you don't want to become all consumed with trying to create this, massive piece of content when, dependent on what you're trying to do and where you're trying to surface it, little 5-minute videos or pieces to camera, or even on your phone can be really compelling as long as it's contextualized.
So this the sort of the thought process that I have off of that too, and this kind of goes to that idea of what is compelling content, and this might be a bit outside your sort of the scope of delivering the content, but do you have any opinions on what do you think are some of the best ways that you can measure the success of content? How would you recommend organizations go about demonstrating that a piece of content is sort of making that impact?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a couple of points here and a couple of key metrics to probably look at. I mean, from a Go One perspective, there's numbers that we look at, like daily active usage, enrollment numbers, completion numbers, all of these kinds of data points that we look at that will help us have this sort of helicopter view of what's hot and not within our marketplace and what is working. And obviously, time spent in a piece of content, like you could have 2 courses and people spend 10 minutes in each one, but this course here is actually 60 minutes long and they're only doing 10 minutes versus this 10-minute course which they're actually completing. So from our perspective, and when we look at it in that way, there's a number of different matrices that we can look at and call on to help us understand what is good and compelling content. Organizationally, it's more talking to your sort of return on investment conversation and how do we know that all of this money that we're spending on training up our staff is actually working? And I'd love to tell organizations that there's a quick one for this, but the reality is it speaks back to your overarching commitment to training up your staff, because ultimately for me, the most compelling piece to that ROI is a long-term approach of actually looking at, for example, taking your sales team. If we've taken a 2 to 3 year commitment in upskilling or 12-month commitment in upskilling, and we want to see the return on that, obviously it's a performance related thing, right? And you go back to how is that sales team performing? Obviously taking into perspective other factors out in the marketplace. So there's a big sort of bottom line component to it where you can look at it and say, okay, well, if our goal and objective is to have a more functioning sales team that are firing on all cylinders, then we probably want to take a slightly longer 12-month approach and be very considered on how we deliver that. But I think there are also shorter term measurements and return on investment factors that you can look at. But a lot of that actually just involves engaging the staff. And I think there's this concept when it comes to training that it's just put the content out there and we're done. And then we move on to the next thing, when actually I would argue that content is one component of it, but that ongoing engagement and sort of almost learning pathway approach to this is far more compelling. And so, looping back in, making sure that you're talking to the teams and the individuals that you are looking to upskill to understand how successful they've done it, how successful they found it is really critical. And the great thing is there's so much technology out there to be able to do that in a really quick and meaningful way, whether it's sort of surveys or just even chats within the platforms themselves to be able to understand this. Because again, I'd love to say that there is this sort of one size fits all approach to this, but if you're going to be serious about training up people and trying to understand the success measures, it's really important that you understand what's appealing and going to work for the individual employees. And that can get difficult if you don't have the ability to be able to surface different types and styles of content to different members of the team.
Yeah. Just a final question on that, actually. Have you seen any trends of the types of content that seems to work across the board, or that people are using more regularly, or where people are seeing the most successes, or is it pretty sporadic?
I do think, there's sort of been a lot of talk over the last few years around micro courses, short courses, nano courses, these really sort of bite-sized pieces of material that can be accessed really quickly. Again, I hate to harp on about it, but it really is around contextualizing the training, right? And I think how that's delivered in the mode is really important. So whether it is video, audio, etc., is going to be super subjective on the individual. But I do find that these bite-sized pieces of content are really effective. And again, if I think about that example I gave earlier with the Teams integration, if I'm part of a stand-up or team meeting where we're talking about new technology and talking maybe about data science or artificial intelligence or machine learning, and I don't really have a good grasp on what that actually means, the ability for me to go and do a quick 5-minute introduction course into the intros of data science, just to give me some context and understanding, is really, really helpful. Obviously, if I'm trying to get a deeper understanding of what data science is about, I might engage on a 2, 3, 6 week course that takes up a lot of time. And then we're talking about a whole different structure as far as what that content needs to look like, the assessments and everything else. So I think it really, I hate not giving very specific and direct answers, but I think hopefully what this is starting to do is getting people thinking about, okay, well, what are my goals and objectives for this piece of content? What am I trying to really get out of my staff and my people? And what kind of behavior and patterns do I want to set up? Because more often than not, the really successful bits of content are those short pieces that then trigger some interest or engagement with the employees, who then do go on to look at engaging in more, maybe a 45-minute video, maybe a 2-week interactive course. And you sort of need to take that relatively iterative approach. But I think, they're dependent on what you're trying to do and what your goals and objectives are, dependent on the subjective nature of the individual's learning, will really dictate what's effective.
So, Dan, the one question we kind of have been ending off some of these interviews with, given the times, have you guys been seeing any trends right now with maybe people are looking for specific types of content with COVID-19, remote work? I've seen some stories from our customers in particular where it's like, we need more, high-level professional development things because maybe we've had to furlough some employees. And so in order to keep them working, we're actually going to offer them professional training opportunities. Have you seen any trends on some of GoOne's customers or just sort of in general in terms of what organizations are doing in terms of leveraging content during this time?
Yeah, I think we have. Yeah. And it's obviously, I don't need to tell you guys, this is sort of unprecedented times. I think 100 years or so since the Spanish flu, that probably, well, hopefully this won't have as big an impact. But absolutely, it's been really interesting. I think there's two components to this, and one is that we've worked with you guys quite closely on as well, which is this evolving learning pathway that we've put out around COVID-19. So when I think back 6 weeks or so ago now, where people started to get shut down, locked down, and the world really started to change, a lot of the content that we had in there and the educational components were things like travel and understanding, hand washing and sanitization and so on. And what we started to find, though, is that the world started to change. So once travel got totally locked down, travel wasn't really important anymore because you just couldn't do it. So what else started to become important? And, we'd look at things like remote working, how to be, most efficient and effective while working from home. And so started to focus on the sort of out of office remote working component of, and not just very specific to remote learning, but how to make effective use of time and, procrastination 101 and stuff like that. And so we started to sort of see a shift in supporting people as they went through that transition. But once they got relatively comfortable working from home, it was things like, okay, well, now that we know we've got slightly inflated cybersecurity risks, so maybe what we need to do is look at helping employees and organizations understand the very real risk at a heightened level of cybersecurity. So we want to inject some of that content in there as well. So again, it's coming back to that contextualized piece, but working through it and changing it as the market and as the world needs. So I think there's that sort of organic and evolving pathway as far as the types of content that we can deliver and changing it over time. You comment around furloughed staff and organizations. It's something that we've spoken a lot about. Over here in Australia, we've worked very closely with the likes of Qantas to help provide training to a large number of those staff members that are furloughed or stood down. And so what we've tended to find is that those organisations, and certainly the staff members more so than ever now, are looking to try, and while they're not working, and if they haven't been fortunate enough to find additional work for the time being, is to sort of engage in ongoing educational and learning experiences pertaining to what their job was and what they were looking to do. And I think, yes, we've seen some people looking at, okay, well, I'm working in hospitality, maybe I need to sort of change industries given the profound impact this has had on me. But that's not as big as we've seen, where we've just seen a sort of doubling down of these furloughed personnel, just trying to make sure that if I'm not getting that on-the-job educational experience, what else is important in regards to the work that I do, and how can I continue to develop and grow in those areas? So whether that's leadership, I'm a manager and it's ongoing leadership, whether it's sales and conflict resolution, like there's this real doubling down on the things that are important that maybe normally I'd be getting from that on-the-job learning and experience.
For sure.
Well, Dan, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure having you on the show, and just great to connect with you as always.
Fantastic. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
For more information on what we've discussed today, including links to resources and downloadable assets, go to docebo.com/podcast. That's docebo.com/podcast. And subscribe to our newsletter.
You can also find us on iTunes, Spotify, and all other places where you get your podcasts by searching Learning Elevated. So don't forget to click subscribe so you know when we're disembarking on another floor.